My name is Nix Valo, and I have what most beings would consider the galaxy's most boring job. I'm a security observer aboard orbital station Nexus Prime, which means I spend my days watching surveillance feeds and filing reports about the thrilling activities of docking violations and improper waste disposal. Truly, the stuff of legends. Nexus Prime bills itself as the crown jewel of intergalactic civilization, a shining beacon where the most advanced species in known space gather to conduct business, share knowledge, and pretend they don't secretly despise each other. The station's promotional materials describe it as a harmonious meeting place for peaceful cooperation, and I'm the Emperor of Andromeda. In reality, Nexus Prime is more like a cosmic shopping mall populated by overgrown children with access to energy weapons. The Zephyrians strut around flexing their purple muscles at anything that moves. The crystalline helix beings think they're intellectually superior to everyone else, which they probably are, but nobody likes a show-off. The furry Keth merchants will sell their own grandmothers for the right price, assuming they haven't already. But lately there's been chatter about a new species joining our little dysfunction junction. Humans. Apparently they come from something called a Deathworld, which sounds about as pleasant as it implies. According to the reports crossing my desk, Earth is a planetary nightmare where everything is trying to kill everything else, including the weather, the geology, and probably the plant life too. Most civilized beings avoid Deathworlds entirely. We're smart enough to realize that any planet where survival requires daily mortal combat probably isn't worth colonizing. But humans,
oh no!
They evolved there. They call it home. They actually seem fond of the place, which tells you everything you need to know about their mental state. The stories filtering through official channels read like horror fiction. Creatures called sharks that are basically swimming murder machines. Weather systems that can level cities. Microscopic organisms that wage biological warfare inside their own bodies. And humans just live there. They build civilizations, raise families, and probably complain about the commute to work. Naturally, the station's various species have developed theories about these mythical Deathworlders. Some claim humans must be savage brutes, barely controlled killing machines. Others insist they're probably fragile refugees, traumatized survivors fleeing their hellish homeworld. A few optimists believe they might be reasonable beings who simply had bad luck with planetary real estate. As someone who monitors security feeds for a living, I've learned that reality usually manages to be more ridiculous than anyone's wildest theories. So when I heard that our first human visitor was scheduled to arrive today, I made sure my surveillance equipment was working properly. After all, in my line of work, you learn to appreciate good entertainment when it presents itself, and something told me that humans were going to be very entertaining indeed. The transport ship Stellar Wanderer docked at Bay 7 with all the grace of a drunken asteroid. I watched through security camera 12 as the airlock cycled open, releasing the usual parade of travelers into our sterile corridors. Merchants hauling sample cases, diplomats clutching briefcases, tourists gawking at everything like they'd never seen a space station before. Then she stepped off the ship. Zephyr Blackwood, according to the passenger manifest, the first human to visit Nexus Prime. And honestly, I was underwhelmed. She looked so ordinary. Average height by galactic standards, maybe 5.5 feet tall. Brown hair tied back in a simple ponytail. Dark clothing that appeared practical rather than fashionable. She carried a single duffel bag slung over one shoulder like it weighed nothing. What struck me most was how calm she seemed. Not the nervous energy of a first-time station visitor. Not the wide-eyed wonder of someone seeing alien architecture for the first time. Just a casual, almost bored expression as she glanced around the docking bay, like she was checking out a new grocery store rather than stepping into a hub of galactic civilization. Her movements were efficient, economical. No wasted motion, no hesitation. She walked with a relaxed gait that somehow managed to cover ground faster than beings who were obviously hurrying. Strange. Most species either swagger to show dominance or scurry to avoid attention. Humans apparently just walked. Unfortunately, not everyone appreciated subtle entrances. Klaxon Preet noticed her immediately, which was typical. Klaxon notices everything that might provide entertainment, preferably the kind involving someone else's humiliation. He's a Zephyrian, which means he stands nearly 7 feet tall and is built like a freight loader made of purple muscle and bad decisions. His species evolved on a high-gravity world where conflict resolution apparently involves seeing who can hit hardest. Claxon had appointed himself the station's unofficial entertainment committee, specializing in picking fights with anyone who looked like they might provide amusing resistance. He'd been the resident bully for 3 cycles now, and station security had learned to simply clean up after his demonstrations rather than try to prevent them. I watched him zero in on the human like a predator spotting wounded prey. His crest plates flared with interest, which in Zephyrian body language roughly translates to time for fun. He began moving through the crowd with that distinctive swagger all Zephyrians used when they wanted to intimidate someone. The human seemed oblivious to the approaching mountain of hostile alien muscle. She'd stopped at an information kiosk and was casually reviewing station maps with the same expression someone might use to check their grocery list, completely relaxed, totally unaware of the danger. Or so it appeared. I found myself leaning forward, suddenly very interested in what was about to unfold. Something about her casual demeanor didn't quite ring true. There was an alertness in her posture that suggested she was far more aware of her surroundings than she appeared. This was going to be interesting. Claxon made his move at the food court, because of course he did. Nothing says galactic sophistication like starting fights near the taco dispensers. The human had purchased something called coffee from one of the beverage stations, a dark liquid that smelled like burnt plant matter and regret. She found an empty table in the corner, set down her drink, and began reviewing what appeared to be station documentation on a portable datapad, still maintaining that air of casual indifference that was either genuine or expertly crafted. Claxon approached with his usual theatrical flair, making sure his heavy footsteps echoed dramatically across the polished floor. Several nearby diners looked up with interest. Word had already spread through the gossip networks that a human was aboard, and everyone wanted to see what one looked like in person. The Zephyrian warrior timed his approach perfectly, bumping into Zephyr's table just as she lifted her coffee cup. The hot liquid sloshed dangerously close to the rim but somehow didn't spill. Her hand remained perfectly steady, which should have been Claxon's first warning that he'd misjudged his target. "Oh, terribly sorry," Claxon rumbled in that fake apologetic tone that fooled absolutely nobody. "Didn't see you there, little one. You're so small." Zephyr looked up slowly, meeting his gaze with those dark human eyes. "No fear, no anger, just mild curiosity. No harm done," she replied in a voice that was surprisingly calm. "Though you might want to have your vision checked. Space travel can be hard on the eyes." A few spectators chuckled, which made Claxon's crest plates flare brighter. He wasn't used to witty comebacks from his victims. "Vision's fine," he growled, placing one massive purple hand on her table and leaning down intimidatingly. "I see perfectly well. See a soft little creature from a backwater mudball pretending to belong among real warriors." The surrounding aliens were gathering now, forming a loose circle around the table. Keth merchants paused their deal-making to watch. A group of crystalline helix beings extended their sensory arrays for better observation. Even some off-duty station personnel had materialized, clearly expecting entertainment. "Backwater mudball," like Zephyr repeated thoughtfully, taking another sip of her coffee. You know, that's actually not inaccurate. Earth does have a lot of mud, and water, and things that live in both, and generally object to being disturbed. Your pathetic little world," Kael-san continued, encouraged by what he interpreted as submission, "produces nothing but weak refugees fleeing to civilized space. Tell me, little human, what does your species even contribute to galactic society besides entertainment value?" I watched through multiple camera angles as more beings pressed closer. They were all making the same mistake, interpreting her calm responses as weakness rather than control. Typical. Most species equated loud displays of aggression with actual capability, which was why half the galaxy's conflicts were started by beings who confused volume with competence. "Entertainment value," Zephyr mused, setting down her cup with deliberate precision. "That's an interesting perspective, though I suspect your definition of entertainment might be somewhat limited." "Limited?" Claxon's voice rose, exactly as she'd probably intended. "I am Claxon Preet, champion of the 7th War Ring, victor in 43 formal challenges. I think I know something about real entertainment." 43, she nodded appreciatively. "That's impressive. Out of curiosity, how many of those opponents were from Deathworlds?" The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Hudson's expression shifted slightly, the first crack in his confident facade. "None. he admitted reluctantly. But that's because Deathworlders are supposedly extinct, or myths, or standing right in front of you, Zephyr finished quietly. Word count 600. The food court fell silent. Even the background hum of the air recycling system seemed to pause, as if the station itself was holding its breath. Calaxon's purple skin had shifted to a darker shade that in Zephyrian physiology indicated either arousal or extreme agitation. Given the circumstances, I was betting on the latter. You think you can intimidate me with stories? Calaxon snarled, his voice dropping to that dangerous register that usually preceded violence. Deathworld or not, you're still just a tiny soft thing pretending to be dangerous. Zephyr tilted her head slightly, like she was considering his words with genuine interest. The soft is relative, she observed. And size, well, that's often overrated. But if you're genuinely curious about Deathworld capabilities, I'd be happy to provide a demonstration. Several spectators exchanged glances. This wasn't going according to the usual script. Victims were supposed to back down or start crying, not offer demonstrations. Calaxon's crest plates were now pulsing with aggressive energy. Fine. The sparring arena. Level 5. Standard combat rules. No weapons. Victory by submission or incapacitation. He straightened to his full intimidating height. Unless you'd prefer to apologize for your disrespect and crawl away like the weakling you are. Standard combat rules sound perfect, Zephyr replied, standing up and finishing the last of her coffee. When would be convenient for you? The casual acceptance hit the crowd like a shockwave. The being started pulling out communication devices, clearly spreading word of the impending entertainment. This was going to be the biggest event on the station since the great food poisoning incident of 2387. Now, Calaxon declared, unless you need time to pray to whatever primitive gods your species worships. No gods necessary, Zephyr said, shouldering her duffel bag. But I appreciate the consideration. As the crowd began migrating toward the lifts, I found myself frantically accessing the station's database for information about human combat capabilities. What I found made my tentacles curl with unease. The betting pools had opened within minutes, and the odds were spectacularly lopsided. Calaxon was favored at 20-1, which honestly seemed generous to the human. After all, she barely came up to his chest and probably weighed less than one of his arms. But the more I read about Earth, the more concerned I became. Gravity, 1.3 times, galactic standard. Atmospheric composition that would poison most oxygen breathers. Weather patterns that included frozen precipitation falling from the sky and electrical storms that could power entire cities. And that was just the environment. The fauna reports read like someone's fever dream. Apex predators with bite forces that could crush starship hulls. Microscopic parasites that turned their hosts into walking disease vectors. Something called Australia that appeared to be an entire continent, designed specifically to kill visitors in creative ways. And humans had not only survived all of this, they'd thrived. They'd turned their Deathworld into a garden, tamed the weather, domesticated the predators, and apparently considered the whole experience character building. In the arena staging area, Calaxon was strutting around like he'd already won, flexing his impressive musculature for the gathering crowd. Standard pre-fight intimidation display, designed to demoralize opponents before the actual combat began. Zephyr, meanwhile, had found a quiet corner, and was doing what appeared to be simple stretching exercises. Nothing dramatic, just basic flexibility work that any reasonable being might do before mild physical activity. She looked like she was preparing for a casual jog, not a fight with a 7-foot wall of muscle and hostility. Having second thoughts, little human, Calaxon called across the staging area. It's not too late to admit you're outmatched. Oh, I'm definitely outmatched, Zephyr agreed cheerfully. You've got significant advantages in reach, mass, and probably raw strength, plus all that formal combat training. Calaxon preened at the acknowledgement. Of course, she continued conversationally. I do have one small advantage of my own. And what's that? Calaxon scoffed. Zephyr smiled for the first time since arriving on the station. It wasn't a particularly pleasant expression. I'm from a Deathworld. The sparring arena filled to capacity within minutes. Word had spread through the station faster than a hull breach, and beings were actually paying premium credits for viewing spots. Nothing drew a crowd quite like the prospect of watching someone get thoroughly demolished by a professional warrior. The arena itself was a standard 20-meter circle with reinforced flooring and energy barriers to protect the spectators from any debris, or in this case from any pieces of human that might go flying when Klaxon got serious. Referee Gleep Tonto, a small insectoid being with excellent reflexes and absolutely no sense of self-preservation, called the combatants to the center circle. The size difference was even more dramatic under the arena lights. Klaxon looked like a purple mountain next to Zephyr's modest frame. Standard rules apply. Gleep chittered nervously. Victory by submission, unconsciousness, or inability to continue. Medical teams are standing by. Try not to create too much mess for the cleaning crews. The crowd roared its approval as both fighters returned to their starting positions. I counted at least 15 different species in the stands, all of them clearly anticipating a quick and bloody conclusion. Klaxon cracked his knuckles, a sound like breaking timber that echoed through the arena. Last chance to surrender gracefully, little human. Zephyr rolled her shoulders casually. I'll keep that in mind. The starting bell chimed, and Klaxon immediately charged forward with textbook Zephyrian aggression. His opening move was a classic overhead strike designed to overwhelm opponents with sheer force and intimidation. Zephyr sidestepped the attack with minimal effort, like she was avoiding a puddle rather than a crushing blow. Klaxon's fist struck the arena floor with enough force to crack the reinforced surface. Lucky dodge, someone shouted from the crowd. Klaxon spun and launched a backhand that should have connected solidly with Zephyr's torso. Instead, she seemed to flow around the strike, taking what appeared to be a glancing blow to her shoulder that sent her stumbling backward. The crowd cheered as Klaxon pressed his advantage, following up with a series of punches and kicks that drove the human steadily toward the arena wall. Each strike appeared to connect. Each impact drew gasps from the spectators, and Zephyr seemed to be taking serious damage. This is going exactly as expected, announced Vrex Mondo, a Helix commentator who'd appointed himself play-by-play announcer. The human is clearly outmatched and taking punishment. This should be over soon. But something was bothering me as I watched through multiple camera angles. Zephyr's defensive movements seemed almost choreographed. She was taking hits, yes, but they were all glancing blows or impacts to non-vital areas, and every time she stumbled or appeared to stagger, she ended up in a slightly better position than before. More importantly, her breathing remained steady, no signs of panic, no desperation in her movements. She was taking damage, but she wasn't fighting like someone who was losing. She was fighting like someone who was studying. Klaxon landed what looked like a solid blow to her ribs, and Zephyr doubled over with an audible grunt of pain. The crowd went wild, sensing the end approaching. Several beings near the front were already collecting on their bets. Finish her, someone screamed from the upper levels. Put the Deathworlder out of her misery, another voice added. Klaxon raised both fists above his head for a dramatic finishing blow, playing to the crowd like the seasoned arena performer he was. This was his moment of triumph, the conclusive proof that raw Zephyrian power could overcome any mythical Deathworld nonsense. Zephyr looked up at him from her doubled-over position, and I caught something in her expression that made my tentacles freeze. She wasn't hurt. She wasn't even particularly concerned. She was calculating. You know what? She said conversationally, straightening up with fluid grace that suggested her injuries had been significantly exaggerated. I think I've learned enough about your fighting style. Klaxon's triumphant expression faltered as he realized the human was no longer playing defense. Her stance had shifted from reactive to predatory, and suddenly the arena felt different. Time to stop being polite, Zephyr continued, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. The crowd's cheering faded to confused murmurs as beings began to sense that something fundamental had just changed. Klaxon himself took an involuntary step backward, his warrior instincts finally recognizing what his arrogance had missed. He wasn't fighting a victim anymore. He was fighting a predator who had just finished analyzing his weaknesses. And she was done playing nice. What happened next redefined my understanding of the phrase rapid escalation. Taliexon, still confident, despite the human's ominous tone change, launched another overhead strike, standard Zephyrian power move, the same technique that had intimidated opponents across 43 previous victories. Zephyr didn't dodge this time. Instead, she stepped forward into the attack, caught his descending wrist with both hands, and used his own momentum to redirect the blow past her head. Before Klaxon could recover, she had pivoted around his extended arm and delivered what appeared to be a casual elbow strike to a pressure point just below his shoulder joint. The 7-foot warrior's right arm went completely limp. The arena fell silent except for Klaxon's sharp intake of breath. He stared at his useless appendage with the expression of someone who'd just discovered that gravity was optional. Brachial plexus nerve cluster, Zephyr explained helpfully, like she was teaching an anatomy class. Temporary paralysis should wear off in about 20 minutes, assuming you don't aggravate it. Klaxon roared and swung his good arm in a wild haymaker. Zephyr ducked under the punch, grabbed his belt, and somehow used his own charging momentum to send him stumbling across the arena like a drunken freight loader. She'd turned a 7-foot, 300-pound warrior into a pinball. Physics, she called after him, conversationally. It's surprisingly useful once you understand leverage and momentum transfer. The crowd was no longer cheering. Hundreds of beings sat in stunned silence as they watched their champion warrior getting systematically dismantled by someone who barely came up to his chest. Klaxon recovered his balance and charged again, this time leading with his good arm in a straightforward tackle attempt. Basic strategy when finesse fails, overwhelming force usually works. Zephyr sidestepped at the last second, grabbed the back of his neck as he passed, and guided his trajectory directly into the arena wall. The impact was spectacular. Klaxon hit the reinforced barrier with enough force to make the entire structure vibrate. Redirected kinetic energy, she announced, to the arena at large. Takes minimal effort when you let your opponent provide all the power. Klaxon peeled himself off the wall, purple skin now showing multiple scrapes and what would undoubtedly become impressive bruises. His expression had shifted from confident aggression to confused panic. "What are you?" he gasped. "Adaptable," Zephyr replied, circling him with predatory patience. "It's what happens when your species evolves, dodging lightning storms and avoiding things with more teeth than you." Klaxon made one final desperate attempt, lunging forward with his functioning arm extended in a grab. Zephyr caught his wrist, stepped backward to maintain his forward momentum, and then dropped flat on her back. Her feet came up to contact his midsection, and suddenly Klaxon was airborne. He flew in a perfect arc across the arena, limbs flailing helplessly before landing in an undignified heap near the center circle. The impactor drove all the air from his lungs in a whoosh that echoed through the silent stadium. "Basic judo throw," Zephyr said, kipping up to her feet with casual grace. "We invented it because sometimes the best way to win a fight is to let your opponent throw themselves." Klaxon lay gasping on the arena floor, one arm paralyzed, covered in scrapes, and apparently reconsidering every life choice that had led to this moment. Zephyr walked over and knelt beside him with the same helpful expression she'd worn while reviewing station maps. "The thing about Deathworlds," she said quietly, though her words carried clearly through the arena's acoustics, "is that they don't just make you strong, they make you smart. Creative. When everything on your planet wants to kill you, you learn to use every advantage available." She stood and looked around the silent crowd, including overconfidence. Referee Gleep Tonto cleared his throat nervously. "Winner by submission, Zephyr Blackwood." The crowd remained silent. Even the betting computers seemed too shocked to process the results. Klaxon groaned from the floor. "I yield," he whispered. "Good choice," Zephyr replied cheerfully. The most disturbing part of the entire spectacle wasn't the systematic dismantling of a professional warrior. It was what happened next. Zephyr helped Klaxon to his feet with the same cheerful efficiency she'd used to destroy him. She supported his weight as his legs wobbled, guided his functioning arm around her shoulders, and began walking him toward the arena exit like they were old friends heading out for drinks. "Medical bays on level 3, she said, conversationally as they made their slow progress across the arena floor. "The nerve damage should resolve completely, though you might want to ice those bruises. Earth Remedy works surprisingly well for reducing swelling." Klaxon could only manage stunned grunts in response. "You've got excellent reach and your power generation is impressive," she continued, completely ignoring his traumatized state. "But you telegraph your attacks about 3 seconds before execution. Works fine against opponents who rely on strength, but predictability can be problematic against adaptive fighters." The crowd parted like water as they approached the exit, beings literally pressing themselves against the walls to avoid contact with the terrifying human who dispensed combat advice, while helping her victims to medical attention. They'd made it halfway to the medical bay when Captain Rourke Sterling arrived, jogging down the corridor with the expression of someone who'd just heard impossible news and wanted to verify it personally. "Blackwood," he called out, slightly out of breath. "What did you do?" "Sir," Zephyr replied calmly, still supporting the wobbling klaxon, "I participated in a friendly sparring match and provided some educational demonstrations regarding Deathworld combat techniques." Sterling looked at the purple warrior draped over his crew member's shoulders, noted the obvious injuries and traumatized expression, and began laughing. Not polite chuckling or nervous humor, but genuine belly laughs that echoed through the corridor. "Let me guess," he wheezed between laughs. "Someone challenged the survival instructor to a fight without asking what she taught." "Survival instructor," Klaxon managed weakly. "Zephyr here runs the Advanced Wilderness Survival Program for the Colonial Marines," Sterling explained with obvious pride. "Specializes in hostile environment operations, spent the last 5 years teaching soldiers how to stay alive on planets that actively try to kill visitors." Several station security officers had gathered to hear this explanation, and I noticed their expressions shifting from confusion to horror as the implications sank in. The Australian outback, Siberian tundra, Amazon rainforest. Sterling continued enthusiastically. "If an environment can kill you in creative ways, she's probably trained people to survive it. Oh, and she holds black belts in 6 different martial arts systems." "6?" one of the security officers squeaked. "Minimum requirement for the job," Zephyr said modestly. "You never know what kind of predators you'll encounter, so it's important to stay flexible in your defensive options." By this point, word was spreading through the station's communication networks faster than gossip at a diplomatic reception. The initial reports had been dismissed as impossible, but now beings were reviewing security footage and reaching the uncomfortable conclusion that humans were significantly more dangerous than advertised. At the medical bay, Dr. Prex Kelton, a spindly helix physician, examined Klaxon with professional efficiency while shooting nervous glances at Zephyr. "Temporary nerve paralysis, multiple contusions, and what appears to be severe damage to his ego," the doctor reported. "Full recovery expected, though he may want to reconsider his career in recreational violence." "Excellent news," Zephyr said brightly. "I was worried about permanent damage. Earth sparring can be a bit intense for beings from more civilized worlds." Captain Sterling clapped her on the shoulder. "Come on, Blackwood. Let's get you checked in properly. I suspect station administration is going to want a very detailed conversation about human capabilities and proper diplomatic protocols." As they walked away, I heard Klaxon whisper to the doctor, "She was helping me the whole time, even after why was she helping me?" Dr. Kelton's response was barely audible, "Because that's apparently what humans do. They break you, then fix you, then teach you how to be better." 3 hours after the fight, I was still processing security reports and trying to understand how everything I thought I knew about galactic civilization had been turned upside down by one small human with a cheerful disposition and absolutely terrifying combat skills. The station dynamics had shifted dramatically. Beings who'd been swaggering through the corridors that morning were now walking with considerably more humility. The Zephyrian delegation had called an emergency meeting to discuss revised assessment protocols for newly contacted species. Even the arrogant Helix intellectuals were quietly updating their databases with a new category labeled Deathworld Survival Adaptations. Klaxon himself had become something of a celebrity, though not the kind he'd originally intended. Level beings kept approaching him for first-hand accounts of what it felt like to be systematically dismantled by someone half his size. He'd gone from station bully to cautionary tale in the span of a single afternoon. Meanwhile, Zephyr had checked into her assigned quarters, filed her arrival paperwork, and submitted a polite incident report that described the entire affair as a minor cultural exchange with educational value. She'd then proceeded to the station's gymnasium for what she called her regular workout routine, apparently treating a fight that had traumatized an entire space station as barely worth mentioning. I watched through the gym's security cameras as she performed exercises that looked like they'd been designed by someone with a grudge against the human skeletal system. She lifted weights that would challenge most Zephyrians, ran on the treadmill at speeds that qualified as emergency evacuation pace for other species, and finished with flexibility training that made my tentacles ache just watching. All while humming what appeared to be a cheerful tune. It occurred to me that we'd been thinking about civilization all wrong. We'd assumed that technological advancement and peaceful cooperation were signs of evolutionary superiority, that beings who'd moved beyond physical conflict were naturally more advanced than those who hadn't. But watching Zephyr's casual competence, I began wondering if we'd confused comfort with capability. We'd become so accustomed to solving problems with technology and bureaucracy that we'd forgotten how to adapt when those solutions weren't available. Humans, on the other hand, had been forced to develop solutions that worked regardless of circumstances. When your environment actively tries to kill you, you learn to be resourceful. When survival depends on adapting to changing conditions, you become flexible. When cooperation means the difference between life and death, you learn to help even former enemies. The betting pools had paid out quietly, with most participants too embarrassed to discuss their spectacular misjudgment. The odds makers were already working on new calculation methods that included something called Deathworld advantage factors. Captain Sterling had spent the afternoon in meetings with station administration, apparently fielding questions about human capabilities and discussing protocols for future visits. Word was that Nexus Prime's security department was revising their threat assessment procedures to account for species that didn't fit traditional danger profiles. As I compiled my final incident report, I found myself wondering what other assumptions we'd made about primitive species that might prove equally incorrect. How many civilizations had we dismissed as underdeveloped, simply because they'd chosen different technological paths or retained capabilities we'd abandoned? Zephyr finished her workout and headed for the mess hall, where she ordered something called a protein shake and struck up casual conversations with several beings who'd witnessed her arena performance. She seemed genuinely interested in learning about their home worlds and cultures, displaying the same focused attention she'd used to analyze Klaxon's fighting style. The beings she spoke with were polite but visibly nervous, like they were chatting with a friendly predator who might decide to demonstrate hunting techniques at any moment. By the end of her first day aboard Nexus Prime, Zephyr Blackwood had become the most respected and feared individual on the station, not through threats or intimidation, but simply by being herself competent, helpful, and utterly comfortable with violence when necessary. As I filed my report, I made a personal note to treat all future human visitors with considerably more caution and respect. After all, in a galaxy full of beings who'd forgotten how to survive without technology, it paid to be polite to those who remembered. The age of human involvement in galactic affairs had begun with a single quiet arrival and one educational demonstration. I had the distinct feeling things were about to become much more interesting,